For as long as we've had countries, we've had anarchy. No world government, no global 911, no supreme authority. So why isn't international politics just a chaotic, nonstop Game of Thrones style war of all against all? Why do states, even enemies, almost always follow the same rules? They honor treaties, they respect diplomatic immunity, they recognize each other's right to exist. Realists might say power keeps order. Liberals might say institutions do. But the English school says both are right, and both are missing something essential. States form a society, not just a system. That idea, that even in anarchy states form a kind of society, is the starting point for what we call the English school of international relations. The English school begins with a simple but powerful observation. The world may lack a central government, but it isn't always a lawless free-for-all. Anarchy just means there's no authority above the state, but it doesn't mean that there's no order. Instead, the English school argues that states have built a kind of society of states, a community bound together not by government, but by shared rules, norms, and institutions that regulate their behavior. To say that states form a society means three things. First, they recognize one another as sovereign equals. Second, they share common interests, especially in maintaining order and avoiding chaos. And third, they agree to abide by certain rules like non-intervention, respect for diplomacy, and the sanctity of treaties in order to manage their relations peacefully. So while the international system is still anarchic, it's also socially organized. States interact within a framework of expectations, conventions, and mutual understandings that make international life possible. One of the English school's key thinkers, Hedley Bull, called this an anarchical society. In his foundational 1977 book, The Anarchical Society, he makes the key distinction. He acknowledges the realist view of the world, which he calls the international system, defining it as when two or more states have sufficient contact between them and have sufficient impact on one another's actions to cause them to behave, at least in some measures, as parts of a whole. This, however, is just the first level, a world of pure power and interaction. The English school's core insight, Bull argues, is the existence of an international society. He defines this as existing when a group of states, conscious of certain common interests and common values, form a society in the sense that they conceive of themselves to be bound by a common set of rules in their relations with one another and share in the working of common institutions. It is this society, built on shared norms, rules, and institutions, not just on raw power, that explains the remarkable persistence of order in an anarchic world. Beyond this, Bull also pointed to a world society based on moral solidarity among peoples rather than states, the vision of cosmopolitanism. These three levels often coexist. You can think of them as layers, not stages. The raw power politics of the system, the norms and rules of society, and the moral aspirations of a global community. To visualize this, the English school gives us its most famous image, three concentric circles. The outer circle represents the international system, the Hobbesian or realist layer. The middle is the international society, the Grotian rationalist layer. And at the center lies world society, the Kantian or revolutionist ideal. What makes the English school distinctive is its focus on that middle layer, the international society, where order and cooperation emerge not in spite of anarchy, but within it. In that sense, the English school is both realist and idealist. Realist in recognizing the constraints of power and anarchy, but idealist in believing that common rules and institutions can create order even without a world government. The English school then asks a fundamental question. How much order can exist without authority? And what holds that order together? Fear, interest, or shared values? Its answer is deceptively simple. Order in world politics is built through a society of states, an arrangement sustained by diplomacy, law, balance, and mutual recognition. To really understand the English school, we need to look at where its key ideas come from, what Martin Wright calls the three traditions of international thought. Wright, one of the founding figures of the English school, believed that all international theory can be traced back to one of three great intellectual lineages: realism, rationalism, and revolutionism. He linked each to a major philosopher, Hobbes, Grotius, and Kant, and to a different vision of how international politics works. The first is the Hobbesian or the realist tradition. This is the world of power and survival, the idea that in an anarchic system, states must rely on themselves. Order, when it exists, is temporary and rests on balance of power or deterrence. It's the logic of the international system, states interacting, competing, sometimes cooperating, but always under the shadow of potential conflict. The second is the Grotian or the rationalist tradition. Named after Hugo Grotius, the 17th century Dutch jurist, often called the father of international law, this is the middle ground. Grotius argued that even in anarchy, states could create laws, norms, and institutions, not out of altruism, but from a shared interest in stability. This is the heart of the international society, states cooperating to preserve order through diplomacy, law, and restraint. And then there's the Kantian or revolutionist tradition. Here, the focus shifts from states to humanity. Thinkers like Immanuel Kant envisioned a future federation of free states, where reason and moral progress could lead to perpetual peace. It's the logic of world society, where global justice and human rights take precedence over state sovereignty. Together, these three traditions capture the tension at the heart of international relations: the Hobbesian world of power and self-help, the Grotian world of shared rules and cooperation, and the Kantian world of moral solidarity. The English school doesn't reject any of these, instead it tries to balance them. Its main focus, and its center of gravity, is the Grotian middle ground, where anarchy and order coexist. And it's this rationalist middle that gives the English school its distinctive voice, bridging realism's concern with survival and liberalism's hope for cooperation, while remaining deeply rooted in the historical practice of diplomacy and law. If international society exists, if states share common rules and values, then how exactly do they maintain order in an anarchic world? For the English school, the answer lies in what Hedley Bull called the institutions of international society, the enduring practices and arrangements that states use to manage their relationship and to preserve order. These aren't institutions in the narrow organizational sense, but deep, historically rooted practices that define the rules of international life. They're the habits and the conventions that have evolved over centuries to make coexistence possible. Bull identified 5 primary institutions that sustain the society of states. The first is balance of power, perhaps the oldest and most fundamental. For the English school, the balance of power isn't just about deterrence or military strength. It's a social institution, a shared understanding among states that no one power should come to dominate the rest. States actively manage this balance not only through alliances and arms buildup, but through diplomacy and restraint. Second, international law. Even in the absence of world government, states have developed a body of law, treaties, customs, and norms to guide their behavior. It doesn't always prevent conflict, but it establishes expectations and legitimacy. When states violate these laws, they justify themselves, and that, as Hedley Bull argued, is evidence that law still matters. Third, diplomacy, the core mechanism of communication and negotiation between states. Diplomacy allows states to signal intentions, manage crises, and find compromise. The very existence of embassies, even between adversaries, is proof that international society values conversation over coercion. Fourth, war. This one surprises students, but for the English school, war is also an institution, a recognized, regulated form of conflict. It's governed by rules and norms, defining when it's legal to go to war, what we call jus ad bellum, and how it should be fought, or jus in bello. In this sense, war isn't simply chaos. It's a recognized, rule-bound process for settling disputes when all else fails. It's part of the social fabric of the international order, however tragic. And fifth, great power management. Bull and the other English school scholars argue that the great powers have special responsibilities in maintaining order, mediating disputes, enforcing norms, and, when necessary, stabilizing the system. This isn't moral equity, but functional necessity. Order often depends on the leadership and the restraint of the most powerful. Later English school thinkers added other institutions, sovereignty, territoriality, markets, and even the United Nations, as examples of how international society evolves over time. Taken together, these institutions create a kind of grammar for international relations, shared expectations that tell states how to act, when to cooperate, and what lines not to cross. You can see them at work in the modern world. The UN Charter enshrines sovereignty and non-aggression. Diplomatic norms regulate even the most hostile relationships. Balance of power politics continues to shape alliances from Europe to East Asia. Together, these institutions weave the fabric of the international order, not ending conflict, but giving states ways to live within it. They're the scaffolding that holds together the English school's anarchical society. Order not imposed by government, but sustained by shared practices among states. Like any broad school of thought, the English school isn't a single unified theory, but an ongoing conversation about how order in world politics is created and maintained. And at the heart of that conversation lies a fundamental tension. How much should international society value order, and how much should it value justice? Early English school thinkers like Hedley Bull and Adam Watson were what we call pluralists. They believed that the primary goal of international society is to preserve order, to prevent war, protect sovereignty, and allow states with different cultures and political systems to coexist. For pluralists, too much emphasis on moral or humanitarian ideals risks undermining that fragile order. The rules of the game, sovereignty, non-intervention, and legal equality of states, are what keep the peace. But later English school scholars like Nicholas Wheeler and Tim Dunn argued that this vision was too conservative. They advanced a solidarist position, the idea that states share not only an interest in order, but a moral responsibility to promote justice, human rights, and humanitarian protection. In a solidarist international society, states may sometimes be justified in intervening, even violating sovereignty, to prevent atrocities or defend human dignity. This tension between pluralism and solidarism reflects one of the English school's deepest questions. Can we pursue justice without destroying order? And can we preserve order without abandoning justice? Beyond this internal debate, the English school has also faced some external critiques. Some scholars argue that it's too normative and vague, more a moral philosophy than a testable theory. The school describes how states should behave, critics say, but offers fewer tools for predicting what they will do. Others see it as Eurocentric. The very idea of an international society emerged from European history, specifically from the expansion of European rules and norms through colonialism. For much of the world, however, this so-called society of states was something imposed, not chosen. In response, more recent scholars like Barry Buzan, Amitav Acharya, and Shogo Suzuki have worked to globalize the English school, tracing how different regions developed their own forms of international society, sometimes independent of European influence. These efforts connect directly with the broader movement for global IR, the idea that international relations should reflect the experiences and perspectives of the whole world, not just the West. So the English school continues to evolve from a historically European framework to a more plural, global, and inclusive vision of world order. What hasn't changed is its central insight, that the world of states is neither purely anarchic nor perfect harmony, but an ongoing effort to balance power, law, and morality within an anarchical society. Let's come back to the puzzle that we started with. If there's no world government, no global 911, no supreme authority, why isn't international politics just chaos? The English school's answer is that even in anarchy, there's still society. States don't just coexist, they share rules, norms, and institutions that make order possible. They recognize one another as sovereign, they communicate through diplomacy, they balance power to preserve stability, and, at least in principle, follow common laws. That's what Hedley Bull called an anarchical society, a world without government, but with governance. What makes the English school distinctive is its focus on the middle ground between power and principle, between realism's struggle for survival and liberalism's faith in cooperation. It reminds us that international order isn't imposed from above, it's negotiated, practiced, and maintained every day through the shared understandings of states. You can see that logic at work today, whether it's great power competition in the Indo-Pacific, debates over humanitarian intervention, or efforts to reform global institutions. The same questions remain. How can states balance power, law, and morality in an anarchic world? The English school reminds us that international society is always evolving, expanding to include new powers, new norms, and new voices, but still wrestling with the same basic problem of order without government. Of course, that order is never perfect. The tension between order and justice, between pluralism and solidarism, remains unresolved and probably always will. But that's precisely what makes the English school so valuable. It gives us a language for thinking about how states coexist and how much morality the world can bear without losing its stability. In the end, the English school leaves us with a simple but profound insight. Even in a world of anarchy, there can still be order, because international politics is not just a system of power, but a society of states. That's it for now. Once again, please leave any questions you have in the comments section below, and as always, thanks for watching.